The cabins at Whispering Pines multiply in the winter when no one's watching. I count 12 cabins when the last guests check out in October, but when spring arrives and the snow melts, there are always more. Sometimes 15, sometimes 18, sometimes numbers that don't make sense, scattered through the pine trees, like someone was playing a game of architectural roulette. The new cabins look identical to the originals, same log construction and green metal roofs, but they smell different inside, like wet earth and old grief. What makes my skin crawl isn't finding extra cabins that shouldn't exist. It's finding them occupied. Lights glow through windows of cabins that don't appear on any resort map. Smoke curls from chimneys of structures I never built. And sometimes I catch glimpses of families sitting around dinner tables, laughing and talking like they've been coming to Whispering Pines for generations. When I knock on these doors, no one answers, but the laughter stops, and I can feel eyes watching me through curtains that never move. My name is Tommy Bearcloud, and I've been the winter caretaker here for 3 years now. I took this job after my divorce finalized in Kalispell. Needed somewhere isolated to nurse my wounds and figure out what the hell I was doing with my life at 34. The position paid decent money for basically babysitting an empty resort from November through March, making sure pipes didn't freeze, and keeping an eye on things while the owners, the Holsteins, wintered in Phoenix. I grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation near Browning, about 2 hours east of here. My grandmother used to tell stories about places where the boundary between worlds wore thin, where things that shouldn't exist could slip through cracks in reality. I always figured they were just stories meant to keep kids from wandering too far into the wilderness. Now I'm not so sure. The resort sits 15 miles north of Whitefish, accessible only by a gravel road that winds through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The nearest neighbor is a retired forest ranger named Dale Henriksen, who lives in a trailer 5 miles down the mountain. Cell service cuts out about 3 miles up the road, and the landline in the main lodge works maybe half the time. When Mr. Holstein hired me, he mentioned there were protocols for the winter months, a list of guidelines that previous caretakers had developed over the years. He handed me a manila envelope sealed with electrical tape and told me not to open it until after the last guests departed. "Just precautions," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Nothing to worry about, but follow them exactly." That envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 2 weeks while I finished up the season, watching families pack their cars and head back to cities and normal lives. The last guests checked out on October 15th, a young couple from Seattle who couldn't stop taking selfies by the lake. After their taillights disappeared down the mountain, I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon and opened that envelope. Inside were 7 handwritten rules on yellow legal paper, along with a note that read, "These aren't suggestions. Follow them exactly, and you'll make it to spring. Frank Kowalski, 1987 to 1989. I'd never heard of Frank Kowalski. The bourbon burned going down, but not as much as reading those 7 rules. Frank Kowalski's handwriting was cramped and urgent, like he'd written them in a hurry or under stress. Each rule was numbered and underlined twice. Rule 1, never count the cabins after sunset. If you must do maintenance rounds at night, follow the numbered trail markers only. Do not investigate structures that appear between markers. Rule 2, keep the main lodge fireplace burning from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., November through March. Use only the seasoned pine logs from the covered rack behind the building. Never use wood you find elsewhere on the property. Rule 3, if you hear children laughing or playing outside after 10 p.m., do not look out any windows. Turn on the radio loud enough to mask other sounds until dawn. Rule 4, The guest register in the lobby must remain closed during winter months. If pages turn on their own, leave the building immediately and wait in your quarters until morning. Rule 5. Cabin 7 may show lights or smoke from the chimney. This is normal. Do not approach Cabin 7 for any reason between December 1st and February 28th. Rule 6. If you find fresh vehicle tracks in the snow leading to or from cabins, do not follow them. Report nothing to the Holsteins or local authorities. Rule 7. Should additional cabins appear during your stay, treat them as if they have always been there. Do not enter them, but ensure their existence is never acknowledged in writing or conversation. I read through the list 3 times, each pass making less sense than the last. My grandmother's stories about thin places started echoing in my head, but I shook them off. These had to be pranks left by previous caretakers, some kind of tradition to mess with the new guy. I folded the papers and shoved them in my jacket pocket, then walked to the lodge's picture window overlooking the property. 12 cabins dotted the hillside below, connected by gravel paths that formed a rough circle around the central lake. Each structure looked identical from this distance, single-story log buildings with steep green roofs and stone chimneys. Numbers were painted on small wooden signs beside each front door. The lake reflected the October sky like black glass. No wind stirred the water or the pine boughs overhead. The silence felt heavy, different from the comfortable quiet I'd grown up with in the mountains. This felt expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. My phone showed no signal, as expected. The landline in the lodge worked when I tested it, crackling with static but functional. Holstein had left emergency numbers taped beside the phone. The county sheriff, the volunteer fire department in Whitefish, and Dale Henrikson's number. Below those, someone had written, "Don't," in red ink. I spent the rest of that first day familiarizing myself with the property. The main lodge housed a small kitchen, dining area, and lobby with a massive stone fireplace. My quarters were a studio apartment attached to the back, complete with a kitchenette and bathroom. The previous caretaker had left basic supplies, canned food, coffee, batteries, and enough split pine to last the winter. Each cabin had a key hanging on a pegboard in the lodge office, labeled with matching numbers. I tested a few doors, all locked tight, all empty, except for standard furniture covered in white sheets. The cabins smelled musty but normal, like any building that had been closed up for a while. Cabin 7 sat at the far end of the property, closer to the tree line than the others. When I approached it that afternoon, nothing seemed unusual. The windows were dark, no smoke from the chimney, no signs of recent activity. The key turned smoothly in the lock, revealing the same layout as the others. A main room with kitchenette, a bedroom, and a bathroom with a corner shower. But something felt off about the place. The air inside tasted metallic, and the wood floors creaked in patterns that didn't match my footsteps. I found myself counting my breaths, checking over my shoulder for movement that never came. After 10 minutes, I locked up and headed back to the lodge. That evening, I built my first fire following Rule 2. The seasoned pine caught easily, filling the lobby with warm light and the smell of resin. Outside, full darkness had settled over the mountains. I avoided looking toward the cabins, remembering Rule 1, and settled into a leather chair with a paperback western. Around 11, I heard the first sound. Children laughing. The voices drifted through the lodge walls like echoes, distant but clear. 2 kids, maybe 3, playing some kind of game. Their laughter bubbled up from somewhere near the cabins, carefree and bright in the mountain stillness. I remembered Rule 3 and reached for the radio. I twisted the radio dial until I found a classic rock station, broadcasting from Kalispell, cranking the volume until Leonard Skinner drowned out everything else. The children's laughter continued for another few minutes before fading away, replaced by nothing but guitar solos and static. My hands shook as I poured another bourbon. This was exactly what the rules had warned about. Whatever was happening here, Frank Kowalski had experienced it too, and probably other caretakers before him. The realization settled in my gut like a cold stone. This wasn't a prank or hazing tradition. This was survival information. I kept the radio loud until dawn, dozing fitfully in the leather chair. When gray morning light finally crept through the lodge windows, I turned off the music and listened. Normal forest sounds returned. Wind through pine needles, the distant call of a Steller's jay, water lapping against the lakeshore. My first full day alone passed quietly. I checked the generator, tested the backup heating system, and walked the marked trails around the property. The numbered trail markers Frank had mentioned in Rule 1 were small metal discs nailed to trees, painted with reflective numbers 1 through 12. Each marker corresponded to a cabin, creating a clockwise path around the lake. I found myself studying the spaces between markers, looking for signs of additional structures. Nothing obvious stood out in daylight, but I noticed disturbed areas in the pine duff. Circular patches where the forest floor looked different, more compressed, as if heavy objects had rested there recently. That afternoon, I drove to Whitefish for supplies, taking my shopping list and Frank's rules with me. The grocery corral on Highway 93 was staffed by a middle-aged woman with gray braids who recognized my accent. "You're Blackfeet," she said, not asking. "Yeah, Tommy Bearcloud, working up at Whispering Pines for the winter." Her expression shifted. That place. My grandmother was Salish. She used to say the old people avoided that valley, called it a crossing place. Crossing to where? She shrugged, but her eyes stayed serious. "Just be careful up there, and if you start seeing things that don't belong, trust your instincts. Our grandmothers knew about thin places." I bought extra batteries, canned soup, and a bottle of whiskey I couldn't really afford. The drive back up the mountain felt longer than it should have. Shadows stretching across the gravel road as afternoon faded into dusk. The lodge felt warmer when I returned, welcome and even. I restocked the kitchen, checked the fireplace, and prepared for my second night. Outside, snow had started falling. Fat, wet flakes that stuck to the windows and muffled all sound. By 9 p.m., I had a good fire crackling in the hearth. The radio sat ready on the side table, tuned to the Kalispell station. I'd made coffee and settled in with another paperback when I heard the front door of the lodge open. Footsteps crossed the lobby. Heavy boots on hardwood floors, moving toward the guest register desk. I sat frozen in my chair, listening. The steps stopped. Papers rustled, pages turning. Rule 4 flooded back to me. If the guest register turns pages on its own, leave the building immediately. But these weren't pages turning by themselves. Someone was physically in the lobby, reading the register. I could hear them breathing, hear the leather binding creak as they flipped through entries. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the lobby archway. The fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, but I could see the registration desk clearly. No one stood there. The register lay closed, exactly as I'd left it. The page-turning sounds continued. I backed away, snatched my jacket and the bottle of whiskey, then slipped out the rear exit toward my quarters. The snow fell heavier now, already covering my afternoon tracks. Behind me, the lodge windows glowed warm and inviting, but I could still hear those pages turning, someone methodically reading through years of guest signatures. My quarters felt cramped after the spacious lodge, but safer. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and waited. Around midnight, the sounds from the main building stopped. I dozed in my chair until dawn, clutching the flashlight. The next morning, I found the guest register exactly where I'd left it, closed and latched. But when I opened it, fresh ink marked the current date's entry. Mr. and Mrs. Harold Tennyson and family, cabin 7. Checking in for extended stay. The handwriting looked old-fashioned, formal. Below it, someone had drawn a small symbol that made my stomach clench. A circle with 4 lines extending from it. The same marking my grandmother had once sketched in dirt while telling stories about spirits that borrowed human shapes. I flipped through previous pages. October entries showed the Seattle couple and 3 other families who'd checked out on schedule. But scattered throughout the summer records were similar entries. Guests who'd supposedly stayed in cabin 7, all signed with that same formal handwriting, all marked with the symbol. The coffee tasted like copper pennies. I forced myself to eat breakfast and review the rules again. Rule 5 specifically mentioned cabin 7 showing lights or smoke between December 1st and February 28th. Today was October 17th, still weeks away from that time frame. But something was already in cabin 7, something that signed registers and called itself the Tennyson family. I spent the morning researching on the lodge computer, using the spotty internet connection to search for information about the resort's history. Property records showed the land had been purchased by Holstein's grandfather in 1952. But before that, the area had been logged by various companies since the 1890s. One article from the Whitefish Pilot mentioned a logging camp tragedy in 1934. A family named Tennyson had died when their cabin caught fire during a February blizzard. Harold Tennyson, his wife Margaret, and their 2 children had been trapped by snowdrifts that blocked their door. The bodies weren't found until spring. The cabin had been located approximately where cabin 7 now stood. I printed the article and walked to the picture window overlooking the property. Cabin 7 looked normal in afternoon light. No smoke, no signs of activity. But I found myself counting the other cabins visible from this angle. 13. Yesterday, I'd counted 12. Now there were 13. I grabbed binoculars from the office and studied the hillside systematically. The new structure sat between markers 4 and 5, partially hidden by a cluster of young aspens. It looked identical to the others. Same logs, same green roof, same stone chimney. Rule 7 echoed in my mind. Should additional cabins appear, treat them as if they have always been there. I set down the binoculars and poured a drink, even though it was barely 3 in the afternoon. Outside, snow continued falling, erasing my tracks from the day before and covering the evidence of whatever was happening to Whispering Pines. My grandmother always said that some places held memories like water holds heat. Long after the fire goes out, the pot stays warm. Maybe the Tennyson family had never really left this valley. Maybe they'd been waiting 70 years for the right kind of winter, the right kind of witness. I just wished I knew what they wanted from me. The snow kept falling for 3 days straight, transforming Whispering Pines into something from a Christmas card. By October 20th, 18 inches covered the ground, and the access road had become treacherous. I was officially cut off from civilization until the county plow made its rounds, which wouldn't happen until the storm passed. I had established a routine: check the generator and heating systems each morning, maintain the fireplace according to Rule 2, avoid looking toward the cabins after dark, and keep the radio close at hand. The Tennyson Register entry had appeared twice more, always on different dates, always in that same formal handwriting. On the fourth morning, I found vehicle tracks. Fresh tire marks led from the main road down to the cabin area, ending at the 13th cabin, the one that had appeared between markers 4 and 5. The tracks were crisp in the new snow, made by something heavy with wide tires, maybe a pickup truck or SUV. Rule 6 was explicit. If you find fresh vehicle tracks leading to or from cabins, do not follow them. But standing at the lodge window with coffee steaming in my hands, I couldn't stop staring at those tracks. They made no sense. No one could drive up that mountain in this weather without a snowplow. And I'd have heard an engine in the silence. Yet there they were, leading to a cabin that shouldn't exist, left by visitors who couldn't possibly have arrived. I spent the morning inside, reading and trying to ignore what I'd seen, but curiosity ate at me like acid. My grandmother used to say curiosity was both blessing and curse for our people. It led to knowledge, but also to trouble. Around noon, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of following those tracks, I called Dale Henriksen. The landline crackled with static, but his voice came through clear enough. "Tommy? Everything all right up there?" "Yeah, mostly. Quick question. You know anyone driving a big truck or SUV? Someone who might have come up the mountain last night?" Long pause. "Son, no one's getting up that road in this weather. County won't plow until it stops snowing, and that's not forecast for another 2 days." "Right. That's what I figured. You seeing things that don't make sense?" I hesitated. "Maybe." "Listen to me, Tommy. My daddy worked these mountains for 30 years with the Forest Service. He always said that valley where you're at holds on to things, events, people, memories. Sometimes they replay like old movies. Don't try to make sense of it. Just stay safe." After hanging up, I poured a bourbon despite the early hour. Dale's words echoed my grandmother's stories about thin places, about time folding in on itself. Maybe those tire tracks belonged to the Tennyson family, arriving for their eternal stay at Cabin 7. Maybe they'd been making the same journey for 70 years, their 1934 Ford truck leaving marks in snow that fell decades later. That afternoon, I discovered I could see Cabin 7 from my quarters if I stood at just the right angle by the bathroom window. The building looked normal. No lights, no smoke from the chimney. But something about its proportions seemed wrong, like it was simultaneously too close and too far away. I found myself checking that window every hour, watching for changes. Nothing obvious happened, but each time I looked, the cabin seemed slightly different. The angle of the roof, the position of the windows, the color of the logs, subtle shifts that made me question my own memory. By evening, I was jumpy as a cat in a doghouse. Every sound made me turn toward the windows, even though Rule 3 warned against looking outside after 10 p.m. I built up the fire early, using only the seasoned pine from the covered rack as instructed, then settled in with the radio and another Western novel. At 9:47 p.m., the phone rang. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Static filled the line. Then a woman's voice spoke through the interference. "Is this the caretaker?" "Yeah, this is Tommy. Who's this?" "Margaret Tennyson. We're having trouble with the heat in our cabin. Could you come take a look?" The bourbon turned to ice water in my stomach. Margaret Tennyson had died in 1934. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't do maintenance calls after dark. Resort policy. I can check your cabin first thing in the morning." "It's quite cold in here. The children are having difficulty sleeping." I could hear them in the background. 2 young voices, a boy and a girl, complaining about the temperature. Real children's voices, not echoes or tricks of the wind. "Ma'am, I'll come by at first light. Is there anything you can do in the meantime? Extra blankets, maybe?" "We'll manage. Thank you for your concern." The line went dead. I sat staring at the phone for 10 minutes, replaying the conversation. The woman had sounded normal, polite, but concerned about her family's comfort. Just like any guest might sound. Except Margaret Tennyson had been dead for 90 years, and according to the records, she died with her husband and children when their cabin caught fire. Maybe they were still dying. Maybe that's what happened in thin places. Events replayed endlessly. Families relived their final nights over and over, trapped in loops of time that never quite closed. I checked the fireplace and added another log, then turned up the radio. Outside, wind had picked up, driving snow against the lodge windows in rhythmic patterns. The weather forecast called for another foot before the storm moved on. At 11:23 p.m., I heard a car door slam. The sound came from the direction of the cabins, sharp and clear despite the wind. I forced myself not to look out the windows, keeping my eyes fixed on the paperback in my lap while my ears strained for other sounds. Footsteps crunched through snow. Multiple sets, adults and children walking together, voices talking quietly as they approached the lodge. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was casual, conversational. A family arriving for their vacation. The front door of the lodge opened. "Hello?" a man's voice called out. "Anyone here?" "We're the Tennysons. We have a reservation." I gripped the book until my knuckles ached. Rule 4 said to leave the building if the guest register turned pages on its own. But what about when dead people wanted to check in? Footsteps crossed the lobby. The guest register opened with a familiar leather-on-wood sound. Pages turned as someone searched for the right entry. "Here we are," the man said. "Cabin 7, Harold Tennyson and family." More page turning, then the scratch of a pen on paper. "Daddy, can we go swimming in the lake tomorrow?" A little girl's voice. "We'll see, sweetheart. Depends on the weather." "It's always cold here," a boy complained. "I want to go home." "This is home now, son. We've been coming here every winter for years." I counted heartbeats while the family finished their business at the registration desk. Eventually, the front door opened and closed again. Footsteps crunched away through the snow, fading as they headed toward the cabins. When I finally worked up the courage to check the lobby, the register showed a fresh entry in that same formal handwriting. "Mr. and Mrs. Harold Tennyson and family, Cabin 7, annual winter stay." This time, someone had added a note in different handwriting, maybe a child's careful script. "We like it here. The other families are nice." Other families. I walked to the picture window and looked out at the property, breaking Rule 1 without thinking. Snow fell steadily through the glow of the lodge's exterior lights. But beyond that reach, darkness held secrets I wasn't ready to understand. Lights flickered in windows scattered across the hillside. Not just Cabin 7, but others too. Warm yellow glows that suggested hearth fires and table lamps and families settling in for the night. I counted at least 6 cabins showing signs of occupation, maybe more. The Tennysons weren't alone at Whispering Pines. They'd found other families, other guests who'd checked in for stays that never ended. I backed away from the window and reached for the whiskey bottle. Tomorrow I'd have to decide whether to investigate those occupied cabins or pretend I'd never seen their lights. Either choice felt dangerous, but ignoring them felt like the safer bet. After all, Frank Kowalski's rules had kept him alive for 2 winters. Maybe if I followed them exactly, I'd make it to spring too. I woke up the next morning with a splitting headache and the taste of copper pennies coating my tongue. Breaking Rule 1 had consequences, apparently, My vision swam whenever I turned my head too quickly, and shadows seemed to lag behind moving objects like afterimages burned into my retinas. The snow had stopped overnight, leaving whispering pines buried under 2 feet of pristine white. From my quarters, I could see the tire tracks from yesterday had been covered completely, as if they'd never existed. But the footprints leading to and from the lodge remained visible. Multiple sets of boots, including small ones that could only belong to children. I made coffee with shaking hands and checked the guest register. 3 new entries had appeared overnight, all in different handwriting styles. The Morrison family, Cabin 3, Reunion Weekend, James and Dorothy Kemp, Cabin 11, Anniversary Celebration, the Chen family, Cabin 4, Winter Holiday. Below the Kemp entry, someone had drawn the same 4-lined circle symbol I'd seen under the Tennyson signature. My grandmother's mark for spirits that wore human shapes. The coffee tasted like ash, but I forced it down anyway. Outside, smoke rose from multiple chimneys across the property, 6 plumes of gray against the pale morning sky. Normal families would be waking up, making breakfast, planning their day. But these weren't normal families. I spent the morning avoiding the windows and trying to focus on routine maintenance. The generator needed fuel. The backup heating system required inspection, and I had to clear snow from the lodge's emergency exits. Physical work helped settle my nerves and gave me an excuse to stay busy. Around noon, while I was shoveling the front walkway, a child's voice called out from somewhere nearby. "Mister, can you help us?" I looked up to see a boy of maybe 8 years old standing at the edge of the pine trees. He wore clothes that looked decades out of style: wool knickers, knee-high socks, and a heavy coat with brass buttons. His face was pale, almost translucent in the filtered sunlight. "We can't find our cabin," he said. "Mama sent me to ask for directions." This wasn't covered by any of Frank's rules. The boy looked real enough, solid, not like a ghost from a movie. But everything about him felt wrong. The way he stood perfectly still in the snow. The way his voice carried clearly across the distance, without echoing off the surrounding trees. "What's your family name, son?" "Morrison. We're staying in Cabin 3. I remembered the register entry from that morning. The Morrison family, Reunion Weekend. But Cabin 3 was clearly visible from where the boy stood, smoke rising from its chimney, windows glowing with warm light. "Cabin 3 is right there," I said, pointing. "The one with the red door." The boy turned to look where I'd indicated, then back at me. "I don't see it. Everything looks the same in the snow." A chill crawled up my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. The boy couldn't see his own cabin, even though it was 40 yards away, with smoke pouring from the chimney. Maybe the families existed in layers of time that didn't always connect, pockets of reality that overlapped but never quite aligned. "Walk toward that smoke," I said carefully. "Follow the path that curves around the lake." "Thank you, mister. Mama will be worried if I'm gone too long." The boy turned and walked toward the tree line, not toward Cabin 3. I watched him disappear into the forest, heading in completely the wrong direction, despite my instructions. A few minutes later, I saw him emerge from the trees near Cabin 3, walking up to the front door as if he'd been coming from that direction all along. The door opened before he reached it. A woman in a 1950s-style dress stepped out to greet him, her voice carrying clearly across the snow. "There you are, David. We were starting to worry. The caretaker helped me find the way home, Mama. That was kind of him. Wave goodbye, dear." The boy turned and waved at me. I raised my hand automatically, then caught myself. Was acknowledging them breaking some unwritten rule? Were Frank's 7 guidelines complete, or just the beginning? That afternoon, I tried calling Dale Henriksen again, but the line crackled with so much static I could barely make out his voice. The interference sounded almost like whispers, multiple conversations happening at once, just below the threshold of understanding. By evening, I'd counted 19 cabins. The number had grown throughout the day, new structures appearing in clearings that had been empty that morning. Each one looked original, like it had always been there, with established fire rings and well-worn paths connecting them to the main trail system. Rule 7 said to treat additional cabins as if they'd always existed, but it was getting harder to remember which ones were real and which had appeared overnight. My memory felt unreliable, edited, like someone was changing the past while I wasn't paying attention. I built up the fireplace early and settled in with the radio, keeping the volume loud enough to mask any sounds from outside. But around 9 p.m., the radio began picking up different stations. Old-time music from the 1940s and 50s. News broadcasts about events that had happened decades ago. Children's programs that hadn't aired since my father was young. The voices were clear, professional, exactly like period radio shows. But between songs and announcements, I caught fragments of conversation that sounded like party chatter. Adults laughing, children playing, the clink of glasses and rustle of clothing. I tried changing stations, but every frequency carried the same mix of vintage programming and social sounds. The families were broadcasting their own entertainment, creating their own timeline where different eras blended together like ingredients in a stew. At 10:15 p.m., someone knocked on the lodge's front door. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks. Polite but insistent. Rule 3 warned against acknowledging children's voices after 10 p.m., but said nothing about knocking. I sat frozen in my chair, listening to my own heartbeat while the knocking repeated. "Hello?" A woman's voice called through the door. "We're sorry to bother you so late, but we're having a small gathering and wondered if you'd like to join us." The voice sounded warm, friendly, genuinely inviting, like a neighbor asking me over for coffee and dessert. "It's just a few families getting together," the woman continued. "Nothing fancy. We thought you might be lonely up here by yourself." I wanted to answer. The isolation was wearing on me, and the idea of normal human company felt appealing. But these weren't normal humans, and their version of a gathering might not be something I could walk away from. "Thank you for the invitation," I called back, "but I need to stay here tonight. Resort policy." "Of course, we understand. Perhaps another time." Footsteps crunched away through the snow, but I could hear other voices joining the first woman, a whole group of people walking together, talking and laughing as they headed back toward the cabins. Through the radio static, I caught fragments of party music drifting across the property. Big band sounds, swing dancing, the kind of celebration my grandparents might have attended in their youth. The families were having their gathering whether I joined them or not. I added another log to the fire and checked Frank's rules one more time. 7 guidelines to keep me safe until spring. But spring felt like a lifetime away, and I was starting to wonder if the families would let me leave when the snow melted. Outside, the party music played until dawn. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that dropped below 0 and wind that howled through the pine trees like wounded animals. I'd been at Whispering Pines for 2 weeks, and the isolation was starting to eat at my sanity. The families had grown bolder, their activities spilling over into daylight hours when they'd previously remained hidden. I woke on November 3rd to find fresh snow had fallen overnight, and with it came evidence that disturbed me more than anything I'd witnessed so far. Footprints surrounded the lodge, dozens of them, maybe more. Adults and children had walked circles around the building, their tracks forming complex spirals and figure-8 patterns in the powder. But these weren't random wanderings. The patterns looked purposeful, ritualistic, like some kind of ceremony had taken place while I slept. At the center of each spiral, someone had drawn symbols in the snow, the same 4-line circles I'd seen in the guest register, along with others I didn't recognize. My coffee mug rattled against my teeth as I studied the tracks from the lodge window. The families were trying to tell me something, or maybe trying to prepare something. Either way, their attention was focused on me now, not just on their eternal stay at the resort. The guest register showed 6 new entries from overnight, bringing the total occupancy to 12 families. Names I'd never heard of, handwriting that spanned decades of styles, all claiming cabins that hadn't existed when I'd first arrived. The property now hosted 24 structures scattered across the hillside, each one looking as established as the originals. I spent the morning checking heating systems and clearing snow from emergency exits, routine work that kept my hands busy while my mind raced. The families were expanding their presence, claiming more territory with each passing day. At this rate, Whispering Pines would be completely overrun by Christmas. Around noon, while I was splitting firewood behind the lodge, I heard children singing. Their voices drifted through the trees, clear and sweet despite the wind. A playground song I remembered from elementary school, but with words that didn't quite match my memory. Instead of the familiar rhyme about Ring Around the Rosie, they sang about winter guests who never leave, about caretakers who join the dance, about snow that covers up the old world to make room for the new. Rule 3 warned against acknowledging children's sounds after 10 p.m., but said nothing about daytime activities. I kept splitting wood and tried to ignore the singing, but the melody wormed into my head and stayed there. By evening, I caught myself humming along without realizing it. That night, the phone calls started. Every hour on the hour, the landline would ring 3 times, then stop. When I finally answered on the 4th call, a man's voice greeted me like an old friend. "Tommy, how are you settling in? This is Harold Tennyson. We met briefly when we checked in." "Mr. Tennyson?" I kept my voice steady. "What can I do for you? The families have been talking, and we're concerned about you up there alone. Winter can be hard on a man's spirit. We'd like to invite you for dinner tomorrow evening. Nothing fancy, just good company and a home-cooked meal." The offer sounded genuine, almost tempting. I hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, surviving on canned soup and instant coffee. But dining with dead people felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. "That's kind of you, but I need to stay available in case of emergencies. Resort policy." "Of course, we understand. But Tommy, if you change your mind, you're always welcome. We're neighbors now, after all." The line went dead, leaving me staring at the handset. Neighbors. Like I belonged here. Like I was becoming part of their eternal community, whether I wanted to or not. I poured 3 fingers of bourbon and settled by the fireplace, adding logs according to Rule 2. The seasoned pine caught quickly, filling the lodge with warmth and the smell of resin. Outside, wind drove snow against the windows in hypnotic patterns. At 2:17 a.m., the fire went out. Not died down, went out completely, as if someone had dumped water on the flames. The lodge plunged into darkness so absolute I couldn't see my own hands. Cold air rushed through the room like the building had suddenly lost its walls. I fumbled for my flashlight, but the batteries were dead despite being fresh yesterday. My phone showed no charge either. Every electrical device in the lodge had failed simultaneously. Rule 2 was clear. Keep the fireplace burning from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. I'd broken the rule, and now I was paying the price. Voices whispered in the darkness around me, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Men, women, children, all talking at once in languages I couldn't identify. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they sounded like accusations. They were disappointed in me, angry that I'd failed such a simple task. I crawled across the floor toward where I remembered leaving matches, my hands searching frantically through the darkness. The whispers followed me, circling like wolves around wounded prey. Something brushed against my shoulder. Fingers, maybe, or the edge of a coat. My fingers finally found the matchbox on the side table. I struck one with shaking hands, and blessed orange light flared in the lodge. The whispers stopped instantly, but I could feel eyes watching me from every shadow. I built up the fire larger than necessary, using half my remaining wood supply. The flames roared back to life, driving away the cold and darkness. But I'd learned my lesson. The rules weren't suggestions. They were the only things keeping me safe from whatever the families really wanted. The next day brought new challenges. I found that Cabin 7 had moved during the night. Instead of sitting at the far end of the property near the tree line, it now occupied a clearing much closer to the lodge. The building looked identical, same logs, same green roof, same stone chimney. But its position had shifted by at least 200 yards. I checked the trail markers and counted cabins obsessively, trying to make sense of the changing landscape. 24 structures remained, but their arrangement had altered subtly. Buildings I remembered being near the lake now sat higher on the hillside. Cabins that had been scattered through the forest now formed loose clusters around Cabin 7. The families were rearranging their territory, organizing themselves into a more structured community. And they were moving closer to the lodge, closer to me. That afternoon, I tried calling Dale Henriksen again. The line connected, but his voice sounded strange, distant, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Tommy, you sound different. Everything all right?" "Define all right. The families are getting more active, more aggressive." "Families?" "The dead guests. The ones who never checked out." Long silence. "Son, you sure you're not just dealing with cabin fever? Isolation plays tricks on the mind." "Dale, I'm looking at 24 cabins right now. When I arrived, there were 12. Tommy, listen to me carefully. Whispering Pines has always had 24 cabins. I helped Holstein's daddy build half of them back in '78. The phone slipped in my sweaty palm. Dale's memory was being altered, edited to match the family's version of reality. If they could change the past in other people's minds, how long before they changed mine too? "Dale, do you remember Frank Kowalski? Previous caretaker, worked there in the late '80s. "Never heard that name, son. Far as I know, you're the first winter caretaker Holstein ever hired." The line went dead. I stared at the handset, then at Frank's rules taped to the wall beside the phone. The paper looked older now, yellowed around the edges, like it had been hanging there for years instead of weeks. I was losing my anchor to the real world. The families weren't just occupying the resort. They were rewriting its history, making themselves the original guests, and me the newcomer who'd stumbled into their domain. Outside my quarters window, smoke rose from every cabin chimney. Warm light glowed in windows across the property. Children played in the snow between buildings, their laughter carrying on the wind. A whole community thrived in the growing darkness, and they wanted me to join them. The bourbon tasted like metal, but I finished the glass anyway. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new challenges to the rules that kept me human. The families were patient. They had all winter to wear down my resistance, all winter to convince me that belonging was better than surviving alone. But I still had Frank's rules, even if the rest of the world had forgotten he ever existed. 7 guidelines written by a man who'd faced the same choices I was facing now. A man who'd found a way to escape, even if history couldn't remember his name. I added another log to the fire and settled in for another long night of radio static and whispered invitations. Spring was still 4 months away, but I was starting to wonder if I'd recognize it when it came. By mid-November, I'd stopped trusting my own memory. Each morning brought subtle changes to the property that I couldn't quite pin down. Cabin doors painted different colors, windows that faced new directions, paths that curved where they'd once been straight. The families were reshaping Whispering Pines day by day, and my mind struggled to hold on to the original layout. I'd taken to photographing the property with an old Polaroid camera I found in the lodge office, hoping the pictures would serve as proof of what had been real. But when I developed them, the images showed the current arrangement of cabins, not the one I remembered taking pictures of. Even photographic evidence bent to the family's version of reality. The guest register now contained 43 entries spanning nearly a century. Names from the 1920s, mixed with signatures from the 1980s, all claiming to be current guests. The earliest entry belonged to the Whitmore family, dated 1923, written in fountain pen ink that still looked wet despite being decades old. I'd memorized Frank Kowalski's rules, carrying them with me everywhere in case the paper disappeared like everything else was disappearing. 7 simple guidelines that felt increasingly fragile against the family's growing influence. On November 18th, everything changed. I woke to silence so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. No wind through the pines, no settling sounds from the lodge, no distant hum of the generator. The world had been muted overnight, wrapped in cotton and buried under snow that fell without sound. My breath came out in visible puffs despite the heating system running all night. The temperature had dropped so low that frost covered the inside of my quarters' windows. But when I checked the thermostat, it read 72 degrees. Something was fundamentally wrong with the lodge. I dressed quickly and checked the main building. The fireplace held only cold ashes, though I clearly remembered banking it properly before bed. Rule 2 broken again, but this time not through any fault of mine. The families were sabotaging my ability to follow Frank's guidelines. The guest register lay open on the reception desk, pages fluttering in a breeze I couldn't feel. Fresh ink gleamed on the current day's entry. Thomas Bearcloud, Caretaker's quarters, checking in for permanent residence. My own name, written in handwriting that looked like mine, but felt wrong. Below it, someone had drawn the 4-line circle symbol, claiming me as one of their own. I grabbed a pen and crossed out the entry, writing "not checking in" beside it in bold letters. But as I watched, my words faded until the page showed only the original entry. The families weren't just rewriting history, they were editing the present in real time. Outside, snow fell upward. Flakes drifted from the ground toward the gray sky, defying gravity in streams of white that spiraled around the cabin chimneys. The lake's surface rippled with waves that moved backward, flowing away from the shore instead of toward it. Even the smoke from the family's fires curled downward before disappearing into the earth. Everything was reversing, unwinding, returning to some previous state that existed before Tommy Bearcloud arrived at Whispering Pines. I tried calling Dale Henriksen, but the phone produced only dial tone. When I checked the phone book, his number had been replaced by a listing for Henriksen Memorial Services, serving the community since 1923. Below that, in smaller print, Dale Henriksen, 1934 to 1987. Rest in peace. Dale was dead, had been dead for years, according to this new timeline. The man I'd been talking to for weeks was just another echo, another memory the families were using to keep me isolated and confused. My hands shook as I poured coffee that tasted like dirt and ash. The families had cut my last connection to the outside world. Now I was truly alone with them, trapped in their pocket of reverse time, while they slowly absorbed me into their eternal community. That afternoon, Margaret Tennyson came to visit. She knocked politely on the lodge's front door, then entered without waiting for an answer. A woman in her 40s wearing a blue wool dress from the 1930s, she moved with the grace of someone who'd had decades to perfect her performance as a living person. "Mr. Bearcloud, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to check on you personally." She looked solid, real, warm-blooded. If I'd met her anywhere else, I'd have assumed she was a normal woman concerned about a neighbor's welfare. "Mrs. Tennyson." I kept the reception desk between us. "What can I do for you?" "The families have been discussing your situation. We're worried about your health. You've been looking tired, stressed. The isolation isn't good for anyone." "I'm fine. Just doing my job." "Of course you are. But Tommy, may I call you Tommy? We think it's time you joined us properly. No more of this caretaker business. No more staying separate from the community. You belong here now." Her smile was warm, maternal, exactly what a concerned neighbor might offer. But her eyes held depths that spoke of decades spent practicing human expressions. "I appreciate the concern, but I have responsibilities here. The Holsteins are counting on me to maintain the property." "The Holsteins haven't owned this property for 30 years, dear. This is our home now, and we take care of our own." She stepped closer, and I caught the scent of old roses and something underneath it. Earth, dampness, the smell of things long buried. "Your grandmother would understand," Margaret continued. "She knew about places like this, didn't she? Places where time folds in on itself, where families can find peace even after the world says they should be gone." "Don't talk about my grandmother." "She's welcome here too, Tommy. All your family is welcome. The dead don't stay dead in places like Whispering Pines. They just find new ways to exist." I backed toward the office door, but Margaret followed at the same measured pace. "You've been fighting us for weeks, following those silly rules some previous caretaker left behind. But Frank Kowalski never existed, Tommy. There never was a Frank Kowalski. Those rules came from somewhere else entirely." She was right, and that terrified me more than anything else. I'd been clinging to guidelines written by a man who'd been erased from history, following advice that might have come from the families themselves. What if the rules weren't protection? What if they were training, preparing me for exactly this moment? "The children drew pictures of you," Margaret said, pulling folded papers from her dress pocket. "They're excited about having a new friend." She unfolded crayon drawings that showed stick figures of adults and children standing together outside log cabins. In each picture, one adult figure was labeled Tommy in a child's careful handwriting. They'd been planning this integration for weeks, drawing me into their family portraits before I'd even agreed to join them. "We don't want to hurt you," Margaret continued. "We just want you to stop fighting what's already happened. You belong here now. The outside world has forgotten you exist, just like it forgot Frank and all the others who came before." "Others? Did you think you were the first caretaker to stay the winter? The first to discover our little community?" "Oh, Tommy, there have been so many over the years. All of them eventually realized that belonging was better than being alone. She gestured toward the guest register. Look at the names. Really look. Half of those families are former caretakers and their loved ones. People who chose to stay, to become part of something larger than themselves. I glanced at the register, despite myself. Names that had seemed random now formed patterns. Single men who'd arrived as caretakers, then returned with wives and children in subsequent entries. The Morrison boy I'd met was probably descended from a caretaker who'd taken this job decades ago and never left. The choice is simple, Margaret said. Fight us until spring and spend the rest of your life wondering if any of this really happened, or accept our invitation and find the family you've been looking for since your divorce. She was offering exactly what I'd come to Montana seeking: community, belonging, a place where I wouldn't have to face the world alone. The families knew my weak spots and were pressing them with surgical precision. I need time to think about it. Of course, dear, but don't take too long. Winter's only half over, and the longer you wait, the harder the transition becomes. Margaret folded the children's drawings and placed them on the reception desk, then walked to the front door. Oh, and Tommy? You might want to check cabin 7 this evening. Harold's been having trouble with the heating system again. Nothing serious, but it would mean a lot to the children if you'd take a look. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving me alone with the drawings and the growing certainty that I was running out of ways to say no. That evening, I stood at the lodge window, staring at cabin 7. Warm light glowed in every window, and smoke poured from the chimney in thick gray columns. Through the glass, I could see shadows moving inside, the Tennyson family going about their evening routine, unaware that their heating system supposedly needed attention. Margaret's request felt like a test. Rule 5 said not to approach cabin 7 between December 1st and February 28th, but it was still November. Technically, I could check their heating without breaking Frank's guidelines, but everything about the situation screamed trap. I'd spent 3 hours examining those children's drawings Margaret left behind. Each picture showed the same scene: families standing together outside their cabins, smiling and waving at the viewer. But in the corner of every drawing, one figure stood apart from the others. A lone man by the lodge, watching but not participating. The children had been drawing me for weeks, documenting my isolation while planning my integration. They knew I was lonely, knew I wanted to belong somewhere. The families understood human nature better than humans did, having had decades to study people like me. At 8:47 p.m., Harold Tennyson called. "Tommy, I hate to bother you, but we're having real trouble with the heat now. The children are getting cold, and Margaret's worried about little Susan catching pneumonia." His voice carried genuine concern, exactly what a father would sound like when his family was suffering. But I remembered what Margaret had said about there being many caretakers before me, all of whom had eventually chosen to stay. "Mr. Tennyson, I can check your system first thing in the morning. It's not safe to do electrical work in the dark." "I understand, but Tommy..." His voice broke slightly. "My children died once from the cold. I can't let it happen again." The line went quiet except for background sounds: children coughing, Margaret murmuring comfort, the creak of old wood settling. Real family sounds, real distress, real need. "Please," Harold whispered. "Just this once. I'm begging you." I'd spent my whole life helping people. It was why I'd become a maintenance worker instead of following my father into oil field work. Why I'd volunteered for flood cleanup in Browning. Why I'd taken this caretaker job in the first place. Turning away from a family in need went against everything I believed about being a decent human being. "I'll be over in 20 minutes. "Thank you, Tommy. You don't know what this means to us." I grabbed my toolbox and headed out into the November night. Snow crunched under my boots as I followed the path toward Cabin 7, my flashlight beam cutting through darkness that felt thicker than it should. The other cabins glowed with warm light, and I caught glimpses of families through their windows, parents reading bedtime stories, children playing board games, normal domestic scenes that would have been comforting anywhere else. Cabin 7 sat 30 yards ahead, smoke pouring from its chimney, windows bright with welcoming light. The front door opened before I reached it, and Harold Tennyson stepped out to greet me. He looked exactly like I'd expected. A man in his 40s wearing suspenders and a white dress shirt. Somebody who'd stepped out of a 1930s family photograph. His face showed relief and gratitude as he watched me approach. Tommy, thank God. The children were starting to shiver, and Margaret was beside herself with worry. Let me take a look at your heating system. Where's the thermostat? Right inside. Please, come in. I stepped through the doorway and immediately knew I'd made a mistake. The cabin's interior didn't match its exterior proportions. Instead of the single-room layout I'd seen in other cabins, Cabin 7 opened into a spacious living area with multiple rooms branching off like spokes on a wheel. A fire crackled in a stone hearth that was far too large for the building's footprint, and family photographs covered every available wall surface. The pictures showed the Tennysons in various settings over what appeared to be decades. Picnics by the lake, Christmas mornings, birthday parties, summer vacations. But in every photo, they looked exactly the same age, wearing the same clothes, frozen in time like insects in amber. The thermostat's over here, Harold said, leading me toward the kitchen. Though I should mention, our heating system is a bit different from the others. Margaret stood at the stove, stirring something that smelled like beef stew, wearing the same blue wool dress she'd worn that afternoon. Two children sat at a kitchen table working on homework with fountain pens and inkwells, supplies that belonged in the museum, not a modern vacation rental. Mr. Tommy. The little girl, Susan, looked up from her arithmetic. Daddy said you might help us stay warm. That's right, sweetheart. Mr. Tommy is very kind. The boy, David, studied me with solemn eyes that held too much knowledge for someone his age. Are you going to live here with us now? David, mind your manners. Margaret said gently, Mr. Tommy is just here to fix our heat. But there was no thermostat on the kitchen wall. No heating vents, no radiators, no sign of any modern climate control system. The only heat source was the fireplace in the main room, and that was burning far hotter than any normal fire should. I don't see a heating system, I said carefully. Oh, it's not that kind of heating, Harold explained. Our warmth comes from family, from belonging, from having people who care about each other. That's why we need you to stay, Tommy. Without enough people, the fire goes out. The kitchen walls began to shift, expanding outward while maintaining their cozy proportions. More family photographs appeared, showing scenes I'd never witnessed but somehow remembered. Myself at their dinner table, playing catch with David in the yard, helping Margaret with holiday cooking. False memories being planted in real time. You don't have to be alone anymore, Margaret said, ladling stew into a bowl. Look around, Tommy. Really look. This is what you've been searching for since your divorce. She was right. The scene was everything I'd lost when my marriage fell apart. Family dinners, children's laughter, a sense of purpose beyond just survival. But it was also a trap disguised as salvation, a web of false belonging that would cost me my humanity. I need to go back to the lodge, I said, backing toward the door. But you haven't fixed our heating yet, Susan said, her voice carrying disappointment that cut like a knife. I'll come back tomorrow, during daylight." "Tommy, wait." Harold stepped between me and the exit. "Let me show you something." He pulled a photograph from his shirt pocket, a family portrait that included me. Tommy Bear Cloud standing behind the Tennyson children with his hands on their shoulders, smiling like he belonged there. The picture looked decades old, faded and yellowed around the edges. "This was taken last Christmas," Harold said. "You don't remember because you're still fighting the transition. But you've been part of our family for months now." False memories flooded my mind. Decorating a Christmas tree with Susan, teaching David how to whittle, long conversations with Harold about life and loss. The memories felt real, complete with emotional weight and sensory details. For a moment, I could almost believe I'd been living at Cabin 7 all along. "That's not real," I said, but my voice sounded uncertain even to me. "Look deeper," Margaret said. "Remember what your grandmother told you about thin places, about boundaries that wear down over time. You've been crossing back and forth between our world and yours for weeks now. Eventually, you have to choose which side to call home." The cabin door swung shut behind me, though no one had touched it. Outside, the path back to the lodge had disappeared under fresh snow, leaving no trace of my footprints. Even if I wanted to leave, I was trapped here until the families decided to let me go. "Stay for dinner," Margaret said. "Just dinner. Then decide." The stew smelled incredible, and the children looked at me with such hope that refusing felt cruel. But I remembered Frank's rules, remembered the warnings about treating additional cabins as if they'd always existed. The families wanted me to normalize this moment, to accept their version of reality so completely that I'd forget where I'd come from. "I'm sorry," I said, pulling out my phone and activating the flashlight function, "but I remember who I am." I kicked open the cabin door and ran into the night, following my phone's weak light through snow that fell in all directions at once. Behind me, the Tennysons called my name, their voices full of hurt and disappointment. But I kept running toward the lodge, toward Frank's rules, toward whatever remained of Tommy Bear Cloud in a world that was trying to erase him completely. I survived the winter at Whispering Pines, but I'm not sure I escaped it. March 15th came with a warm Chinook wind that melted the snow in 3 days, revealing a property that looked exactly like it had when I'd first arrived in October. 12 cabins dotted the hillside around the lake, each one properly numbered and positioned according to the original resort map. The extra structures had vanished with the snow, taking their impossible occupants back to whatever pocket of time they called home. The guest registers showed only legitimate entries from last season. Families who'd checked in and out on schedule, no mysterious signatures or 4-line symbols. The manila envelope with Frank's rules had disappeared from my quarters, leaving no evidence that such guidelines had ever existed. When the county snowplow finally cleared the access road, I drove down the mountain without looking back. The Holsteins met me in Whitefish with my final paycheck and praise for maintaining the property so well during an exceptionally harsh winter. They mentioned nothing about families who shouldn't exist, or rules that kept caretakers alive. But I know what I experienced up there. The scars prove it. 3 fingers on my left hand show frostbite damage from the night the fireplace went out, though the medical records claim I was treated for exposure after falling through lake ice. My memory holds fragments that don't match the official timeline, conversations with dead people, photographs that showed false histories, children who drew pictures of futures that never came to pass. I took a job in Billings working maintenance for the school district, something normal and grounded in the everyday world. But every winter, when the first snow falls and the nights grow long, I feel the pull of thin places calling me back to the mountains, Dale Henriksen stopped by my apartment last month. He looked exactly as I remembered, alive, concerned, carrying the weight of decades spent watching over forests that held secrets. According to him, he'd never spoken to me during my time at Whispering Pines, had never heard of Frank Kowalski, and couldn't explain why his phone number was listed in my call history 17 times. "But I'll tell you something," he said before leaving. "That valley's always been wrong. My daddy used to say it was a crossing place where different times touched each other. Maybe you saw what was, what is, and what might be all mixed together like ingredients in a stew." He paused at my door, studying my face with eyes that held their own collection of mountain mysteries. "You did good up there, staying yourself. Takes strength to turn down belonging when you want it that bad. Last week, I received a postcard with no return address. The front showed a vintage photograph of Whispering Pines from the 1950s, all 12 cabins arranged exactly as I remembered. The back contained a message written in a child's careful handwriting. "Mr. Tommy, we miss you. The new caretaker is nice, but he doesn't tell stories like you did. We hope you're happy in your world. Love, Susan and David." I never told the Tennyson children any stories, but somewhere in the space between what happened and what I remember, maybe I did. Maybe I spent entire evenings in Cabin 7, reading fairy tales and sharing family dinners, living a parallel life that felt more real than reality. The Holsteins hired a new winter caretaker this year, a young man from Browning who needed the isolation to finish writing his novel. I thought about warning him, about trying to explain what he might encounter up there. Instead, I sent him a manila envelope containing 7 handwritten rules on yellow legal paper. He probably thinks they're a prank, some tradition meant to mess with the new guy. But if the families return this winter, if the cabins multiply in the snow, and the past bleeds through the present, maybe Frank Kowalski's guidelines will keep him alive until spring. After all, that's what they did for me.